Thanks all for being here. I'm delighted to be on a panel moderated by a friend of mine and with a new friend and an old friend as well. I'm going to start my timer here to make sure I don't blab too much. Again, thanks for being here. My homework assignment, as I understood it anyway, for this panel, was to talk about directions that the work I presented in 2024 with these folks at the Quarry Farm Symposium, directions it's taken since then, and the directions I think it might go in the future. As such, my remarks today are going to be a little bit speculative, a little bit drafty, but that's kind of what I like about conferencing anyway. That's the exciting part, right? So here goes. My talk at the symposium was titled Mr. Seward's Real Estate Transactions, Comic Imperialism in the Reconstruction Era. I expanded that talk into an article, same title, for a 2025 special issue of Studies in American Humor, edited by Chris Gilbert, who's here. At the very end of that article, I briefly referenced that eternal optimist and opportunist Colonel Sellers, and this is the Colonel Sellers from 1892, the American claimant. Specifically, I made a passing claim about Sellers' dreams of purchasing Siberia and starting a new, more enlightened republic there as being a potential burlesque of U.S. Secretary of State William Seward's Imperial yen, and this is mostly what the article and talk were about, during early Reconstruction. I also, in the article and the talk, spent a lot of time with Twain and other humorists who were mercilessly mocking Seward in newspaper articles and other venues. Since then, I developed research and teaching interests in what Martin Bruckner has labeled the cartographic turn in American literary studies. This interest has led me to reconsider Sellers' rejiggered map of Siberia, on which this is the quote there, on which he's written future over the label Siberia and added in red ink made-up cities that I cannot pronounce, maybe Steve can, Liberty Orlov Solozinski, something like that, Freedom Alana Naya something like that. Right? Close enough. Stephen Rackman, whoever that is, in a great article called Buying Siberia, has aptly described this map as Sellers', quote, largest speculative fantasy, to buy Siberia in the name of democracy in imitation of William H. Seward's acquisition, see, this is why I agree with him, of Alaska in the late 1860s. Rackman also notes that, quote, the names of the towns that are gross Russianizations of American democratic cant, words like freedom and liberty, as well as something that I missed, which is the pun on the imagined capital city, which is called merely capital with an A, right? Which, as Steve points out, reveals that, quote, Sellers' ultimate dream appears to be the conversion of free-flowing global capital into a capital city. In animating Sellers' imperial fever dream through this imaginative map, Twain hints at the rhetorical overlap of nobly democratic language onto less than noble imperial desires. If Sellers is, as Matt Siebold, whoever that is, has noted, the love child of the confidence man and the speculator, and Matt also calls him an adult version of Tom Sawyer, which I quite like. That's in the Gilded Age, right? By the time Sellers becomes Twain's sole intellectual property in The American Claimant, Siebold says, Sellers believes his own bullshit. Nathan Wolfe, who was the keynote speaker and gave a great keynote at that 2024 symposium, in his reading of Sellers, he thinks that Twain ultimately is sympathetic to what he sees as Sellers' relatively pure motives, even though, quote, Sellers' democratic dreams remain cockeyed and unattainable, and his idealism appears an admixture of egotism and delusion. So this is faint praise, right? This sense of misplaced self-belief becomes important when we consider the speculative intentions behind Sellers' map. So because I've been thinking cartographically lately, I would add that Sellers' imaginative palimpsest atop his Siberia map prefigures differences between charting and mapping. So originally this was outlined by Dennis Cosgrove, but it was further developed in my field of early American studies by Edward Watts and Carrie Holt in their 2015 collection, Mapping Region in Early American Writing. For Cosgrove and then for Watts and Holt, mapping is this imaginative process that creates new possibilities for space. Charting, on the other hand, is a process, I'm going to read this quote, a process of defining space based on borders and closure. Right? They have kind of for them, mapping is usually progressive and good, and charting is usually about power and bad. I'm going to twist that a little bit here to make it any kind of imaginative thing is mapping. Right? In this paradigm, Sellers, that Gilded Age paragon of naively optimistic schemes, and this is why his optimism matters, is wholeheartedly a mapper. So in putting into conversation my thinking at the time, at the symposium, and my current scholarly interests, I want to use Sellers' speculative map sort of as a jumping off point from which to consider the deployment of maps and globes as a trope in Gilded Age humor and satire. So Twain goes away now, right? Maps referenced in written humor and especially political cartoons vacillated between Sellers-esque optimism and Twainian cynicism about the possibilities and pitfalls of an emergent post-bellum U.S. imperialism. Whether for or against territorial acquisition, such humor does not merely use maps as metonyms for the spaces and places they represent. They also engage in mapping, right? In that sense, through their shared assumptions about the ease with which maps, and here's where it does return to metonym, maps and thus the territories and the borders that they depict, the ease with which they can be redrawn, written over, ignored, or otherwise reimagined, reconceived, and that's often for imperial ends. First, a caveat, though. I want to make clear that comic cartography as a popular enactment of imagined imperialism was not an invention of the Gilded Age per se. So I got to go to Lyon in April for this fantastic symposium on mapping in American literature. I learned, it was like 4 days, and I learned so much there. So there, I ticked through a bunch of examples of political cartoons, but also a bunch of comic texts, mostly from the 1850s and 1860s, and mostly in comic periodicals, especially those that tried to leverage the Monroe Doctrine, which I mentioned yesterday in my other talk, as justification for taking over places like Cuba or Nicaragua or other desirable locations in the Americas. So what I'm pointing to in the Gilded Age is really merely a continuation of that trope, which was already ongoing, potentially reanimated by the U.S.'s post-war imperial acquisitiveness, on which I focused in some detail, again, largely through the figure of William Seward in my symposium talk and subsequent essay. And most of my focus there was how people were making fun of Seward for this desire to get Alaska, the Caribbean, a bunch of spots like that. So with that said, let's look at 3 Gilded Age, early Gilded Age mostly, cartoons. The first one is the last act of the Monroe Doctrine. This was on the back page of the March 1866 issue of Frank Leslie's Budget of Fun. By the way, 2 of my 3 examples are from Frank Leslie's, and a bunch of the previous ones are as well. In 2024, I was lucky enough to be at the American Antiquarian Society when they got this whole new stack of uncatalogued, undigitized Frank Leslie's Budgets of Fun that was a donation. And so I got to be the first one to go through them, and some of these were things that other folks hadn't seen. So that was, I share with Jim a love for American Antiquarian Society, and it's kind of my scholarly Shangri-La. I go there every couple of years and reread every single comic almanac they have, and all the other periodicals. So that's where I found those. So anyway, this cartoon, so this is, it's not too long after the end of the Civil War, during which the U.S. had not been able to apply the Monroe Doctrine to deter European influence and interference in the Americas. This is why the Monroe Doctrine is coming back here. Right? So during that time, if you know your history, the French Empire installed Austrian Archduke Maximilian as Emperor of Mexico. So Frank Leslie's often invoked the Monroe Doctrine in cartoons throughout the 1860s, almost always targeting the imperial ambitions not of the U.S., but of Britain and France. So even in this same March 1866 issue, there's a second cartoon about enforcing the Monroe Doctrine, and that one is the 2-page centerfold. Anyway, I just want to look at this one today as an example. The caption says, "Uncle Sam, in a rage, treats the foreign intruders to a taste of his muscle." And I'm not going to do full readings of these cartoons, I just want to sort of show some patterns. In the illustration, Uncle Sam plants his right foot on Mexico, holds Maximilian by the ear, and with his other, the left foot is on Mexico, sorry. And with his right foot, lost my place, sorry. Good. Right and left is always tough for me. He kicks England's John Bull off of Canada, right, and into the Atlantic. So Uncle Sam is huge here. He's imposing, he's angry. All three human characters are three-dimensional, larger-than-life figures, and they're atop a flat surface, which is probably a map. You can see the oceans are labeled, right? The countries are labeled. So that assumes mapness, right? But Uncle Sam here is at least twice as tall as his antagonist, demonstrating the U.S.'s might in invoking Monroe Doctrine. The sun setting in the west orients viewers directionally, but muddies the already confused scale. Scale is not really much of a thing here, right? Uncle Sam's stature allows him to fully embody the Monroe Doctrine. He's literally stretching across Mexico, the U.S., and Canada, right? From Atlantic to Pacific coasts. In this way, the cartoon enacts imaginative mapping by physicalizing its call for renewed U.S. influence over the Americas after the Civil War. Here's another one. This will be harder to see for those in the cheap seats. This is also from 1866. This is the cover of the February issue. The political message is similar here, but it's using a different set of icons. There are still, of course, maps. The title is Jonathan's Next Suit, or Just the Fit. It's a very busy, full-page cartoon. It features Brother Jonathan as a customer at a tailor shop run by P. McFenian. This is a reference to the Fenian Brotherhood, an organization of Irish-American radicals seeking Irish independence from British rule. In the 1860s, the Fenians engaged mostly unsuccessfully in armed raids into Canada, over the border from the U.S. into Canada, in an attempt to pressure the British government. Signs in the background say, European customers regularly dressed, fits guaranteed, Maximilian Choker, very latest style, Ireland's Hope, the Fenian style. In this way, the cartoon synthesizes a whole bunch of current events throughout the Americas, implying that the U.S. can and should impose on Canada and Mexico's politics. In the caption, the Fenian tailor, you absolutely cannot read that, so I'll read it for you. So the Fenian tailor is trying to make a sale of Jonathan, right? He points to a bedazzled vest that reads Canada and says, I'm not going to do the Irish accent, but jabbers, Mr. Jonathan, that's a neat little vest for you. It's made on purpose for you. It'll fit elegant. On the left side of the cartoon are two other figures, probably representing Maximilian and John Bull. They're at work on a garment labeled Entente Cordiale, which refers to an entente or an agreement between France, Britain, and Spain in the 1860s about collecting debts from Mexico. Maximilian, the tailor's back pocket, has a paper or handkerchief, I can't tell which, that reads Mexico. Brother Jonathan, though, has his hands in his pocket. He's cutting a relaxed pose, right? He replies to the Fenian tailor, no, I guess that great coat is about the thing for me. In saying this, Brother Jonathan is denying the Irish tailor's request for him to take the Canada vest, to take Canada, right? Instead, he only has eyes for a coat, and that coat has, this one, has two globe maps stitched onto the back, right? Both hemispheres. Jonathan, in his, or maybe the cartoonist's Imperial fever dream, Jonathan doesn't want Canada, he wants the whole world, right? And that's important for my larger study. And it's, the saying goes, you don't dress for the job that you have, you dress for the job that you want. This is why he wants the globe. Okay. One more, and Chris, I think we're getting into Chris Gilbert territory here with this one. And if there were more time, I would be sort of quoting and applying some lessons from Chris's work, because he's really great with political cartoons in terms of methodology for how to study this stuff. But here we see that wanting the whole world can lead to its own problems. This is Frank Bellew. Many of you might know him. He's the most famous of the cartoonists I'm talking about today. 1876 cartoon. So it's 10 years later. It's also a little bit different than the others, in that it features not one but two national characters grappling for territory on not a map, but a globe. And that globe is unwieldy, which is going to be part of my reading of it here. The caption reads, the two young giants, Ivan and Jonathan, reaching for Asia by opposite routes. The historical context of this cartoon is Russia's imperial reach into China, and Central Asia more generally, at the same time that the U.S. has forged a trade agreement with Hawaii. In the image, Russian Ivan is identified by his Yushchenko hat, and from his base in Russia, he reaches a hand to China. The U.S. is represented by Brother Jonathan, though here he certainly looks like Uncle Sam, and by 1876, the two had largely melded in iconography. Jonathan is gripping North America. He has to reach a bit farther to put his left hand on Hawaii, labeled the Sandwich Isles. His torso and legs are basically wrapped around South America already in what I'm calling a Monroe Doctrine embrace, right? There's a certain amount of twinning happening in this image too. Ivan translates to John, John translates to Ivan, right? They're equal in size, they're both wearing hats, they're seemingly on equidistant sides of the globe as the image does it. There are two sides of the global imperialism coin, same coin. So the image is really about competition for Asian markets, but what strikes me here is how unwieldy the roundness of the globe on which they plot their geopolitical machinations makes their efforts. It reminds me a bit of the game of Twister. Does anyone ever remember Twister? Right? Because of the contortions into which Ivan and Jonathan stretch themselves in the service of empire. A more historically contemporary comparison would probably be the children's game King of the Mountain, which was played, in 1876. In that game, kids all struggled to get on top and stay on top, pushing and kicking everyone else off. And more about games later. The caption refers to them as young giants, so they're kids, and their labors are not easy. The map is unstable, the map globe is unstable and slippery, and the fact that it is a rounded globe makes it even more precarious. They look as though they might fall into that cloudy firmament below, right? So imperialism is an awkward and dangerous business, Bellou tells us through this globe caricature. Such dangers were ignored by optimistic or naive dreamers like Colonel Sellers, whose ideological commitment to what over a century later would be dubbed more cynically expanding the area of freedom, and that's what Sellers thinks he's doing, right? But framing it that way tends to occlude such pitfalls. Okay, what are we learning? I'm trying to figure out some conclusions that we can draw from Gilded Age political cartoons and textual humor about empire that communicate through maps and through mapping. So here's what I have so far, and then I'm going to end with I don't know. So first lesson, 19th century cartoons take for granted their audience's geographical literacy. Martin Bruckner has done some great work on this. He's demonstrated widespread geographic literacy throughout the 1800s. Right? So cartoonists will select symbols that they know communicate their messages easily and effectively. And in the 1860s and 1870s, they seem to trust that their audience would be adept at interpreting maps and caricatured maps. Right? They know how to read maps. Second, these cartoons communicate through affect. They offer emotionally charged meditations on imperialism, on geopolitics, whether or not those feelings are those of avarice or anxiety, or more often a mix of both avarice and anxiety. If cartoons operate in part by humanizing abstractions and simplifying complex issues, in doing so they express and appeal to emotions more than they do to logic. So this connects back, as I'm trying to do every once in a while here, to 2024 at Quarry Farm, because our keynote, Nathan Wolfe, wrote this book in 2019, Not Quite Hope and Other Political Emotions in the Gilded Age. And he has lots of great stuff to say on affect. So Wolfe argues that the Gilded Age is, quote, defined both by a phenomenon, political corruption, and a set of feelings about it. These are feelings that Wolfe maintains are negative and anxiety-fueled. Wolfe is looking at how, particularly the political novel in the Gilded Age, as a subgenre, captures, quote, everyday negotiations with the political emotions that define times of ongoing crisis, when a cluster of wearying, anxious emotional states comes to seem like both a grave threat to citizens' agency and the primary way people feel political. Does that sound familiar to you? This is why we did a Gilded Age symposium in 2024. Wolfe's insights into the power of negative emotions also apply to the distrustful, world-weary political humor treating postbellum territorial expansion, which often functions by leveraging the affects of pessimism and desolation, or more optimistically, the affects of avarice, right, to point towards a different way to be, a different way to heal and grow the nation. I wasn't thinking at all about political cartoons when I made that connection when I was reading Wolfe for the first time, but his take on the Gilded Age novel, and especially those feelings of emotion and anxiety, do fit with that well. Okay, third. These cartoons' use of maps goes beyond merely offering them as ideographical shorthand for the places they depict. They're also, and this is maybe my main point, they're also aspirational, right? These cartoons are remapping the world as they want to see it. Such aspirational geography, if that can be my neologism for the day, it's evident in one of my favorite jokes, and this is a joke that is animating my current book project, which I will tell you the title is Manifest Destiny, which I'm very proud of. Okay, this is from March 1867, Frank Leslie's Budget of Fun. An American was asked by a haughty foreigner to bound his country, and thus replied, "America is bounded on the north by the aurora borealis, on the east by the rising sun, and on the west by the procession of equinoxes, and on the south by the day of judgment." This was a really popular joke. I like to trace reprints, I found 80 reprints or other versions of it between 1849 and 1880. And another thing I like to do is see what's happening when those reprints spike. It tended to resurface at times when, in the news, the U.S. was rumored to be acquiring or trying to acquire a new territory. Right? So this joke would kind of ebb and flow with those political machinations. Right? The joke's verbal play highlights the constructedness and rhetorical malleability of borders through comic play with the verbal and visual language of geography. Okay, fourth, and this is related too. In placing three-dimensional figures, particularly national reps, atop two-dimensional maps, some of these cartoons transform the maps into arenas of action. They're more like board games. And I got to look at an original version at this symposium, there were mapping board games in the 1800s that kids and grown-ups played with. So they're akin to board games on which geopolitical pieces move, interact, and do battle. So this is a kind of a gamification of international politics that makes imperial exploits appear relatively easy, maybe even fun. Okay? The final takeaway, and I don't have to belabor this too much here, read Judith Jarros Lee on imperialism beginning with the Northwest Ordinance in 1787, if I have that right? That's the main point here. This is just historical evidence that 1898 is not our date that we should be working with for imperialism. I think most people in the room agree with me there. Okay. I'll end with this. What's next for me? This is where I shrug, right? I don't quite know where this goes for me next. I'm slated, I think it's October, Joe. I'm slated to give a Trouble Begins lecture this fall. And Joe kindly has not yet asked me for an abstract or title. But in putting together this talk, I started thinking I might try and bring together some of these strands, right? The things that I'm interested right now, cultural geography and literary cartography, hemispheric studies, like I talked about yesterday, and then Twain's earlier newspaper writings about potential locales for U.S. expansionism. His comic writings on Nicaragua, on Alaska, and on the Caribbean. And those are out there. And I think you can put those into conversation. So that's my general idea. If any of you who are experts here have suggestions for other directions I should go, other things I should look at, I'm crowdsourcing this. So I'd be very open to them. Okay. All right, thank you so much for listening.